beginning of our strategic planning. David over here is our facilitator. He is a worldwide strategic planner. He goes everywhere. He's a very interesting guy, and he does a process that's different than most of you are going to be used to seeing for strategic planning if you're ever doing strategic planning. We just went through one with the school district. It's going to be a little bit different. It'll be fun. If you guys have any questions on anything logistically, Cynthia, Nikki, you're in the back. Linda's back there too, I think. We need something. We
really
get
not
going,
here.
so we're already a little late, so I'll hand it over to David.
All right, thank you, Manny. Good morning, everybody. All right, so my name's David Burrell, and I'm with a company called Future IQ, and we mostly work North America, Europe, and Australia, mostly with communities and regions, helping people think about the future. So you're obviously starting a process, which is a visioning process that will lead to an action plan for your community. So today is actually a really pivotal piece of the exercise. So it's called a think tank for a very deliberate reason, right? Because we want to have a deep dive into the future and think about what are the different possible scenarios for the future of this community, and then start to think about, well, what would be the scenario you would prefer the most? Okay, so I know the chairs are probably a little uncomfortable, right? But fortunately, you're not going to be stuck in those all day, and you're certainly not going to listen to me all day, because you're going to do the work, and you're at tables with your fellow residents and stakeholders in this community, because the work's going to happen where you are today. All right, so let me just run through the agenda. Can you read that sufficiently? Yeah, we can't help the sun, I'm sorry. So there is a copy of the agenda on the table, there's one per table. But let me just walk through the steps of today, right? So we're going to do a little bit of just setting up a little bit of context, but then we want to take a bit of a deep dive into macro trends. So we want to look at, so I know we're going to talk about the future of Smithfield. And you know, you're a very defined community, but you are embedded in a world. So we want to look at macro trends that are shaping the world, the country, the region, and then where do you fit into that, or what are the implications for you? So we want to do that work. We want to review some of the community survey results. So I know many of you have probably taken the community survey online. We want to show you some of the preliminary results out of that. We want to do a bit of an exercise, which is what these sheets at the front of the room are about, thinking about where your strengths and your weaknesses in terms of your attributes as a community. And then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to dive into a big process where you're going to be the architects thinking about and starting to create narratives around the future. All right, and then we'll run through and we'll be done by 3 o'clock. All right, so Future IQ. So what are we trying to accomplish, right? So ultimately, I think what you're engaging in here today is one of those sort of privileged opportunities you get. It's one of those once in a decade or more moments when a community comes together and has a very thoughtful and serious conversation about your direction. What we're going to be talking about today are things like, what's the very nature of the social fabric you want to build here? Where do you want to invest your money? What type of community do you want to create for the future? You know, what's your vibe like? We want to talk about all those sort of important issues. We want to build on some of the recent planning work. So as you know, there's been a number of surveys and studies that have been done quite recently. This obviously flows from that. And we're conducting this think tank, right? And I mentioned the term think tank. And so why do we conduct a think tank? You know, why do we want to, at this point, have a deep dive? Well, there's a couple of things, right? One is we're in a world that's more complex than we used to have 10 or 20 years ago. Now, the level of complexity and the speed of change, which we'll talk about today, that's accelerating. That demands any community to think more carefully about your decisions, because the consequences are going to be amplified. But this think tank will allow us to have a systematic approach to thinking about the future, because you can kind of think about the future and it can all just be kind of a little like, you know, random and big ideas and things like that, but you can't really sort of bolt it together. We're going to bolt it together. We want to create an awareness of plausible futures. So the whole idea of this think tank and the scenario-based planning is that if you stand here today, 2019, and you look to your future, out to 2030, there's no single future in front of you. But there's at least a range of plausible futures about how it could turn out, based on the decisions you make or don't make, the actions you take or don't take. So what we're going to do today is map out what you might call that plausible future canvas. And then we want to give you a chance, with that in front of you, to think about what's your version of the preferred future. If you could choose, what would be the future that would represent the optimal balance or configuration for your community? Okay? The challenge for you, right? So this is my challenge to you, right? So I'm going to facilitate this, but you're going to do the work. This is your community. My challenge to you is, one, we want to explore the future. We don't do that every day, but we want to be willing to explore the future, think about what big trends are, what they mean for you. We want to be willing to ask the hard questions. You know, and I know from reading the surveys, that there are different views in this community. And you're going through a period of change. So the hard questions are, well, what do we have to trade off here? What are the things that we might be blind to, that we can't see, that we need to be thinking about because they could be really important? The hard questions about how well are we really doing. We also want to be willing to think creatively. To think, because we're exploring, we're speculating about the future, we're sort of being a narrative architect about the future of your community today. All right, so let's talk about expectations, right? So we want to be ambitious and realistic, right, at the same time. So we're going to have an ambitious view of the future, but we want to have one foot in reality. The breadth and the depth of the topic is going to be quite significant, because we're going to start with global, come down to local, transformational in thinking. Our intention would be that you'd walk out of here today with a different view of the future and a different view of what your community could or should look like. Questions for you. What would you like to see originate from this workshop? And what do you personally expect from your participation? So here you are, Saturday. Seems to be a good one. You're stuck inside. How do you want to make the most of that? What would you want to walk out of here having accomplished today, personally and as a group? All right, so I want to give you a chance, just on those last two questions, to share with each other at your tables, right? If you don't know each other, quick introductions would be good. No life stories, just who you are, right? Just to whip around, right? But give you a minute to sort of talk about expectations. What would you like to see originate from this workshop? This is a significant gathering of people in this community at the start of a process that's going to shape future direction. What would you expect to come out of this, and what do you want to get out of this for yourself personally and for your community? Okay, give you a minute at your tables to share with each other. Go.
What are the things we have to do for social media?
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's just hear from a couple of tables, just very quickly. What did you share with each other when you talked about expectations, what you'd like to see come out of this? Let's go. Jason, what did your table talk about? Okay, so you talked about social fabric and those sort of social norms and so on, right? Okay, what else did you talk about? Other groups?
There's a specific issue on a specific item that somebody wanted to push forward.
And what was that?
Bike route.
Sorry?
Bike route.
Bike route, so
Downtown.
connectivity and so on, right? All right. Okay, what else did you talk about in terms of expectations, what you'd like to see come out of this? Table of geniuses here.
Oh, well, I think what we talked about, I mean, I've been around a long time, and just like this table, there's other folks here, but we've seen these things start and die. What we want is some transparency, some feedback. We're all meeting here 6 hours today, boom, we've got great ideas, is it going to die? So we've seen many times.
So what would your wish be?
My wish would be that this 6 hours is not a waste of time. It's something, we finished it. It started, let's get something done. Like, we had an initiative one time, using a group appointed to the city council meeting. Let's get a community center that's going to be. Had an appointed group, boom, never heard it again. So we have a different council, we have different leadership in our management, so it's not pie in the sky, I hope.
Yeah, good point. I mean, it's sometimes we walk into these type of things a little skeptical, right? Sometimes even cynical, right? But mostly skeptical, right? Will anything really come from this, right? And as the mayor said, this is the start of a multi-month process, right? What you're doing today is you're going to be creating, as I mentioned, these scenarios for the future. We're going to take those out and allow the community to interact with those, right? And start to continue to refine down to what would represent the preferred future. You're doing this extra work, you know, the deeper thinking, the heavier lift, to frame out what your future canvas look like. You're doing that on behalf of your community. They'll be able to weigh in on that, right? And quite quickly, I think we'll start to see this notion of where's the preferred future and the detail that's around that. We'll get to some of that today, right? In terms of the transparency issue, at least in this process, we're going to be making all of the data available online, so you'll be able to go online and be able to look at that data and look at the survey results, and you'll be able to interrogate it, filter it, and I'll show you some of the preliminary results from today. All right, good. So there's some expectations, right? So, but we want to now pivot, right? And we want to start to think about what does the future look like in macro sense. So I would guess, having worked in lots of communities, a community like yours could have a feel like it's a bubble, right? You're a bubble in a world, right? You know, it's sort of got that notion of it's a refuge or it's an enclave. You know, you can come back to that. It's got that kind of sense to it. But we're not divorced from or separate from what happens at the larger level of the economy, the world, and the society. So we want to look at what some of those trends are and think about what that might mean for your future. And we're going to look at this in terms of three big sort of theme areas. So one is about population, demographics, and mass urbanisation. That's a really interesting topic area for you, I think, because of your proximity to the Kansas City metropolis. Energy, food, water, changing climatic patterns. Again, that's part of the big economic drivers that underpin who you are. Technology, the next industrial revolution, so this notion of speed of change. So we want to talk about some trend points in these topic areas and what do you think they mean for your future. So let's talk about demographics, population, and mass urbanisation. So this is population in the world, right? And I'm going to show you a string of charts that go from 1950 on the left-hand side to 2050 up here, right? So it's a 100-year period. And why I picked that is that we're sort of close to the middle of that, a bit over halfway through. But it's also a period where we are seeing some of the most epic transformations in what it means for human beings. Okay? The other part is that 1950s, as we start to talk about this, if I look around the room here, there's a fair few of us probably kicked off the operation down here, right? Right? Mostly, hopefully we all make it to the other end, right? But my point is that we have these different views of the world depending on when we're born. Okay, so, and what we want to think about is, okay, how is the world looking as we roll forward? Now, what's different? Well, if you look at this, in 1950, we had less than 3 billion people on the planet. We are now at about 7, a bit over 7, and we're going to run to 9 billion people before that sort of starts to plateau out. The issue here is that the bottom line here is the developed countries, so that's like North America, Europe, Japan, that population line's largely static. The population growth is occurring elsewhere. Let's put that into some numbers for you, right? So on the left here, we have the age pyramids for the developed countries on the left and the developing countries on the right. These bars are 4-year age increments, so 0 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 12, and so on, right? Male and female. And this is in hundreds of millions, right? So this is developed, developing. What do you think is the most significant feature of that chart, or those charts? Sorry?
Young folks in developing countries.
This enormous bubble of people here, which count in the hundreds of millions per age increment, that are coming through in the system in the developing countries. And they haven't yet really marked the world, but they're going to, right? And I want to talk about that because it's going to change what the world looks like in really dramatic ways. This is about speed of change. So this is change in projected population from 2004 to 2050. The reds here is where you've got the highest level of population growth occurring. And that's predominantly through Africa and parts of Asia. Most of the developed countries in the world are flatlining in population growth. Europe's declining. The US is really only sustained by immigration. You know, most developed countries flatlining, but there's this enormous population surge occurring in Asian and African countries. Another phenomenon that's happening at the same time is we're having ageing of populations in a lot of the more developed countries. So if you look here at the US, between 2010 and 2050, the median age goes from 37 to 41. And for other countries, it's even more dramatic. For Mexico, it goes from 26 to 42. That's in the period of 2010 to 2050. Right now, what's happening is those countries' populations are average age or median age is getting older. Okay? There's another phenomenon that's occurring that I think is fascinating for you and relevant is where people live. So this is a global chart, or a chart that looks at global distribution of people between what you would call urban and rural. And urban is defined as centres of over 100,000 people. Right? So this line here is the number of people who live in rural areas. This line here is the number of people who live in urban areas. And we just crossed the point in history where there is now more people living in cities than live in agricultural or rural areas on the planet. And that trend line is going to accelerate. So what does this mean? And I'm going to talk about mass urbanisation. And remember, you sit right on the edge of a significant metropolis. Okay? So this is chart of the world, right? So this is sort of North America, South America, Europe, and then Asia over here. And these circles here represent the number of people who live in cities, and this is 1950, right? So I'm going to do 1950, 2010, 2050. So in 1950, which is where maybe a lot of our headsets were formed, the world looked like this. We had in the US, which was one of the largest concentrations of urban population. There was 100 million people living in cities, and the country was 64% urban. And then the colour coding is just really the overall relative percent, but Britain and places like that were more heavily urbanised, but their populations weren't as large. But you can see the US had some of the most significant total number of people living in cities. 2010, Right, so let me just toggle backwards and forwards. So 1950, 2010. You can see it goes bang, right? We see this mass growth of cities. Now in the US, we now have 255 million people living in cities. We have 82% urban population, but the explosion of number of people living in cities, and that's driven by two things: more people on the planet and more relative percent of people living in cities versus rural areas. But you can see if you go 1950, have a look at Asia and see what happens there. 2010. Now let's look at 2050, right? Because we're going to do a planning process with you that looks at the future of 2030, but we're on the way to 2050. You get to 2050 and it looks like this. We're going to add another 100 million people to cities in the US alone. The US urban population will be 90% of the population will live in cities of over 100,000 people. But look at the rest of the world. So the whole issue is you're right there on the edge of this metropolis. You're one of those, that's one of those metropolises that's going to continue to grow. What does that mean for the future of a place like Smithville? And as Bill Gates said in his annual report, that shift is the equivalent of building a New York City every month to 2060. That's what that concentration of people in cities looks like. There's also a massive shift occurring as a function of that change in population and where population is in the world. There's a shift occurring in wealth and consumer spending and power in the world, right? So this chart here looks at middle class consumer spending power. Middle class consumer spending power is a really good metric if you want to measure consumerism, right? Because when people get to middle class, they've got disposable income. What happens is they start to buy stuff, they start to travel, and so on, right? So this map of the world down the bottom right-hand corner here is color-coded to these sort of slices of the pie. So Asia Pacific is this part of the pie here, North America here, Europe, and so on. And there's two rings in this pie, and the inner ring is middle class spending power in US trillions of dollars in 2009. So here's the inner ring here. The outer ring is middle class spending power in 2030. So we're halfway in that timeline, right, between 2009 and 2030. You probably can't quite see it, but the North American one goes from 5.5 to 5.6 trillion dollars. So there's almost no gas in the tank for middle class spending power growth in the US. But we know that, right? That's been well documented and it's well talked about. The massive growth, almost 600%, occurs in Asia Pacific. So by the time we get to 2030, which is the vision point for the Smithville visioning, we're going to see a completely different configuration for where wealth in the world accrues and where it gets spent than what we have known traditionally or what we even know today. Now, if you want to have sort of some understanding, I think, of what the whole tariff type of deal thing is about, I'd say look no further than that chart. Because rapid change is unnerving for people. So tapping the brakes, trying to slow down that rapid growth, that's a natural reaction, right? Because what we're going to see is the Asia Pacific middle class spending power goes to almost 33 trillion. North America still sticks at 5.6. Right? So that's that whole story of where wealth and power starts to shift in the world. Let's get a little bit closer to home, right? So, and this is some stuff from the Urban Land Institute in Minnesota, but it would be very applicable to here. And it talks about what have been the waves of economic development that we've had that have shaped our society and economy, particularly in Middle America. So, first of all, there's the agricultural economy. You know, people moved out through the Great Plains, settled the land, went farming. You know, you had a horse and 100 acres or whatever, and people 40 acres and had, started to set up the farming operations, right? Then the US and the Middle America, particularly post-Second World War, the industrial era really took off. And that was because a lot of the manufacturing capacity in Europe and Japan was destroyed in the war. The US was really well placed, and just boom, right? So we started to see that whole economic dimension overlay the agricultural economy. But of course, we're now firmly in what you would call the knowledge and experience-based economy. You know, there's 1,000 people a week move to Seattle, 600 people a week move to Portland, and they're predominantly young people who are part of the knowledge and experience-based economy. So what does that mean for the future of Smithville? I want to talk a bit about how society is reconfiguring in America. So this is the distribution of people in rural areas versus small metros and large metros from 1980 to today. The rural population's here, it's pretty much flatlined, right? It's gone sideways. All the growth occurs in the large and small metros and regional centres. I think what this data hides a little bit, and what I think about, and I grew up on a farm in Australia, I rode a horse to primary school, I know agricultural areas, right? I mean, that's my background, right? So, but I look at this data here on rural America, and I think what we're going to see is this is going to change suddenly, because a lot of those people are the same people. And at some point they start to get old, and then you can already see it in the Dakotas, for example, where suddenly you get what they call a demographic cliff, where people just suddenly exit the system, but there's no new people coming into it. And you get to the point where like nursing homes start to shut down, and the whole kind of thing starts to unravel really fast. This is 8 population pyramids for the US. So this is, and you'll notice that there's 2 big bubbles here, right? So it's male and female, and these are the same 4-year kind of age increments going up. One big bubble here, millennials. Another big bubble here, baby boomers. We're talking about a vision for your community 2030. By 2030, baby boomers will have cycled out of leadership roles predominantly, and other generations led by millennials will have cycled in. What does that mean? Okay, now it's not going to be all baby boomers just have to get out of the road, right, and go, right? That's not it, but there's going to be a natural evolution. You know, people stop participating in certain ways, they go into retirement and so on. So by the time we get to 2030, how does that start to shape Smithville? Well, we know a few things. Actually, baby boomers, there's a couple of things that are very interesting. Actually, baby boomers and millennials, or younger generations, share some interest areas that are very interesting for your community. One is about baby boomers seeking active lifestyles, more interaction, walkable communities, all that kind of stuff, right? The younger populations want the same thing, higher connectivity, more walkable areas and so on. But what's going to come with the shift in baby boomers exiting and millennials and other young generations entering will be shifts in societal values. So I want to show you these, right? So if you look at this one here, blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere. This one here is about how soon should baby drink cola, right? Now, we laugh, right? You chuckle, right? But that was actually pretty funky advertising at some point. But I don't think today, blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere, is going to cut it, right? But society changes. At once that was considered cool and trendy, if not sexy, right? Not today. And societal changes tend not to be just incremental over time. They tend to be more like there are sudden tipping points. You know, how do we go from you can smoke anywhere to now where essentially you have to stand in some sort of nasty little cubicle somewhere and do it? Or look at how fast the Me Too movement ran through this country in the last 18 months and upended a whole series of what were conventional norms. But what other societal value shifts might come when we see that massive pivot of baby boomers out and millennials and others into the system? And how do you make sure you're on the right side of that shift? And it's going to be as dramatic as this, right? For sure. Look, for example, at we're in an agricultural area and we've been talking in Future IQ for some time about one of our predictions is the shift away from animal-based proteins. Look at what happens in IPO listings of things like Beyond Meat. So there's these whole series of epic kind of pivots that could be driven by societal values. But some of the ones at the level of cities, and this is called cradle to cradle, is there the potential to see a much higher sensitivity to recycling and environmental impact. Now, we did a session in Mitchell, South Dakota, Corn Palace, capital, the only corn palace in the world, that community, right? I did a session with 550 high school students, and then we did some surveys with them. Number one issue for them, stop messing up the environment. Plastics. Everywhere they go in the world these days, microplastics. We're full of them. Suddenly people go, what the hell? Okay, think of those type of societal pivots. How might that shape your community? Changing patterns in urban living and shopping. Look at the strain that's been placed on traditional retail as we see an entire, disruption occurring of how people shop and buy things. Think about how transportation systems, in the time frame we're talking about, 2030, what % of cars on the road do you think will be autonomous? Driverless. Well, they're already there, right?
No, not really. They have a Google car around it, somebody has drones, it's like,
That's right. So, and there's going to be bumps, right, for sure. But consider what the long-term trend lines are. When do you think the long-haul truck fleet in the US will be largely driverless? There are already dedicated lanes in autobahns in Europe for autonomous trucks. They're piloting convoys, pods and convoys in the US now. So we're going to talk about technology and speed of change, but these type of things are upon us, right? The other thing that's happening is, and this is what I think is very relevant to here, and it's an area that we're really interested in, which is, as we see mass urbanisation, you see this concentration of people into these urban centres, how does society reconfigure and where does innovation occur? So if you think like this, so we have the metropolis, right? So the downtown sort of core. Then we have these suburban rings, then we have a peri-urban space, and then we have these broad, sort of large production, recreation, research zones that occur further out. And even if you just apply this to Kansas City, right, you probably fit into what you would call the peri-urban space, right? So you're just on that edge between the sort of the metropolis and the agricultural productive landscape. This area, by the way, is what I call the arc of innovation. What we're seeing is that that's where a lot of really interesting innovation is starting to accumulate. Sure, downtowns are going through their own sort of reconfiguration. The suburbs, first and second ring suburbs, they're going through that whole urbanisation of suburbs, right? But out here is where there's also lots of really interesting stuff in terms of research, assembly and distribution, localised manufacturing, food processing. There's all sorts of reasons that people come into these peri-urban spaces because cost profile's a little lower, you're running against the traffic in many cases and so on. So thinking about that in terms of how society in the Midwest is clustering around, and you can go, that could be Des Moines or that could be Minneapolis or that could be Dallas-Fort Worth, it's the same story, right? Here for you it's Kansas City, right? And then what's going on around that. All right, so some big data points. Demographics, population, mass urbanisation. We have increasing global population. People are living longer in developed countries at least. There's a global surge in younger cohorts. Greater urbanisation and mega cities forming. We have changing societal values. Society is reconfiguring around these urban hubs. What does that mean for Smithville? All right, so I want to give you a chance at your tables to speculate, right? This is not, there's a right or wrong answer. This is the opportunity to explore the future. What might those trend lines, in broad sense, mean for Smithville and the future of Smithville as we think out to 2030? All right, so I'll give you 5 minutes, go. Okay, so just one more minute and we'll regroup. Okay, so let's regroup, please. All right, thank you. So let's just hear from a couple of groups. What did you talk about in terms of those big, data points in terms of global population, people living longer, changing societal values? What do you think that means for Smithton? What did you talk about? Yeah.
I think one of the challenges is trying to merge the small town feel, the small town values that we like about this community with economic development.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a lot about that today, right? In terms of how do you thread the needle on that small town bubble type feel you've got, right? But what did you draw from those data points, though, macro trends? Do you see that that becomes more challenging for that, or does it enable that?
I think, to me, it looks like it's more challenging.
Yeah. Okay, good. Maybe more challenging, right? Okay, good. Yes.
Hey, David, excuse me 1 second. Could you share the microphone with them so everybody in the room can hear?
At our table, we come from Chicago, Denver, and Long Island, New York. So we all love living here because of that small town feel, but we know that the inevitable is that it is going to grow and come north, but we feel like if that is going to happen, we have to plan so that it's just not spotted here, spotted there. We have to have the infrastructure in place. We have to be planning now so that we can still keep that small town feel with the growth that we're going to have.
Good, and we're going to dive into the small town stuff. That's a key part of the scenario framework we're going to deal with. All right, so let's go to another big theme here, right? So I want to talk about energy, water, food, and changing climatic patterns, right? And what the data points on that say, and again, as I go through this, be thinking about, well, what does this mean for us, right? And why we picked this out is that these are really fundamental, underpinning economic drivers for anywhere in what you would call the Midwest. Okay, the big cities are dependent on it. It drives the regional economy and so on. So let's just talk about what's happening. So let's start at a global level. So we know there's going to be a 25% increase in global population by 2050, right? It's pretty much a given, unless there's some sort of catastrophe. But it doesn't lead to a uniform forecast for increased resource consumption. So for example, energy, that increase in global population is likely to lead to a 50% increase in energy. Why? Because a lot of the population growth in countries where populations are growing are coming out of agrarian poverty. So they're starting to, move up the chains of, consumption and so on. So 50% energy demand increase, 40% fresh water, and 60% increased demand for food. At present, about 2.5 billion people on the planet rely on burning wood and animal dung as their chief source of energy, a little bit of solar starting. 1.5 billion people really have no electricity of any kind. Who's heard the term peak oil? Peak oil? A few people, right? So peak oil is this term, or this concept, because conventional oil is a finite resource. At some point, our ability to be able to extract it starts to decline. And that's pretty much the curve for any finite resource, right? There's you can exploit it or extract it, but at some point, because it gets harder to get to and costs more to get to it, the ability to be able to produce starts to decline. And until really sort of a decade ago, the theory was that we were facing world peak oil production, and if you look at that, that's sort of like around now. And all these lines on this chart were different models. They were industry models, Department of Energy type, scenario modeling and so on. And most of those models forecast this rollover. So this was the 1970s spike in actually US conventional oil production, and it went into peak oil, it rolled over. But globally, they were forecasting it out here. And there was all this stuff about, who remembers drill baby drill? The political rally a few election cycles ago, and it was all about opening up drilling in protected areas on the coastlines in Alaska and so on. That was all about the world, and the US was facing this crisis or pending crisis of conventional oil. And that, fuel prices were spiking, oil was over $100 a barrel, and all that kind of stuff, right? Well, something happened, right? And it was shale oil. And I want to talk about this in terms of its impact, but just remember as I talk about it, this was just a piece of technology that allowed people to do horizontal drilling and fracking and release oil that was known to be there but was considered tightly held or unavailable. Okay, so something that was unavailable became available because of a piece of technology. And the US has these enormous shale oil fields all over. Obviously there's, Texas has enormous ones up through North Dakota into Alberta, and then of course there's huge shale oil fields in Pennsylvania where they're literally one on top of the other, sort of going down, and enormous reserves. And this has caused because 10 years ago the concern was we're not going to have enough fossil fuel to create the energy we need for today, let alone adding a 50% increase in consumption or demand. And shale oil production as a result has just gone, almost exponential. But if you go back only to 2007, it was almost immeasurable, the amount being produced. That's led to increased oil production in the US, coupled with declining demand, mostly through energy efficient standards in cars. And we're now reaching the point where the US becomes basically self-sufficient or a net oil producer, right? But a fundamental pivot in terms of everything like foreign policy, our concerns about oil fields in the Middle East or Venezuela, all that sort of stuff, all of that gets tipped upside down. You can trace all of that back to one piece of technology. So what other kinds of technologies might be coming that could create similar disruptions? Let's talk about renewable energies. And we see those starting to become quite influential in terms of the energy markets, and what's driving that is technology again, because it's reducing costs of production. So these vertical columns here are cost of production in cents per kilowatt hour, and these charts here are mostly 1980 to 2025. Just take wind here in the top right. You can see cost of production just dropped, and then it hit this optimal point 10, 15 years ago, right? And that's where we're not going to extract a lot more efficiency gains by the technology, and so that's when people start to invest. And that's when you start to see massive expansion of solar farms. But you can see solar's doing the same. There's a number of renewable energies that are suddenly reaching these almost optimal price points. What does that lead to? Well, here's global wind power installed capacity. You can just see that going exponential. So suddenly this story about energy being this constraint on the world economy is now we're in a world where we've got abundant energy, right? So this is wind maps in the US, and there's this big wind corridor that comes right down the guts here. So this is wind speed at 80 metres. That's sort of where the turbines are. That's why it's not ground level. But you're right on the edge of that, right? So you're right butting up right against that wind corridor. But that whole renewable energy sector's got a long way to run, as does solar and everything else. The cost of solar, because of technology, there's a logarithmic scale. You can just see it's just dropping like a stone, leads to these massive solar farms. We haven't even talked about tidal, but tidal energy is now starting to get to the point where it's about to become viable. It's going to be tested. There's a number of different prototypes being tested now. So all of a sudden, we go from a world where energy's scarce, we're worried about the price of fuel in our car, we're talking about kind of draconian measures to curb consumption, to suddenly we've got this abundance, right? So energy seems to be taken care of. Let's talk about water. There's now nearly 450 million people in 29 countries facing a severe water shortage, right? So that's not something the Midwest is suffering at the moment. As much as 2/3 of the world's population could be water stressed by 2025. So 2/3 of the world's population, and this is within our planning period of 2030, half of the world's rivers and lakes are seriously polluted, okay? So this is water. So remember those, we're talking about food, water and energy. Water resources, well irrigation uses about 70% of the world's fresh water, and it's the shortage of water is what's going to be forecast to be the constraint on food production, not the lack of arable land. Here's what's really interesting, is the Midwest, the upper Midwest particularly, has 20% of the global freshwater reserves. So you take into account the Great Lakes and those resources, 20% of the global freshwater resources. When 2/3 of the world is facing a future of being water stressed, do you think the embedded value of that water is really priced into the food products yet, or is really developed the way it likely could be one day? Not even anywhere close to it, right? But this abundance of fresh water is an interesting component of the future of anywhere in the Midwest. Let's talk about food, right? So we have this really massive dichotomy in food and food availability for people on the planet. So we have about 2 billion people don't get enough. They're under-nutritioned in some way, lack of calories, nutrients and so on. And we have nearly 2 billion people who get too much. And if you look at where hunger and food production are distributed on the world, that's where it gets really interesting to the Midwest in general. So this chart here is the World Hunger Map from 2018. And so, for example, these countries here, which are the darker browns, and that's where we've got 25 to 30 to over 35% of people in those countries are already hungry. Okay? Kids are underweight, like it's endemic hunger. And that's this whole part of the world here. And then we have hunger that is prevalent through lots of Asia. By the way, that's also where the populations are growing the fastest in the world. So we have this conundrum here, which is we already have lots of hungry people. That's where the world's population is being added. So you can start to see we're facing kind of some tension points. Let's look at the forecast impacts of climate change, and the greens here, so the darker greens, where the forecasts are to be like 25% or plus crop yield increase, and that's a function of technology, application, changing climatic patterns and so on. And then the red areas and the orange areas is where there's going to be forecast crop yield declines. This whole area here, these equatorial areas, is where there's forecast for some substantial crop yield decline. So we have this combination of already hungry people, we're adding a whole bunch of extra people. We're losing land to mass urbanisation, and likely the long-term implications of climate change are that their ability to be able to produce food is going to decline. Now, there's winners and losers, right? And the winners are what you call the northern mid-latitude. So this strip that runs right through here. And you're right there in that. You're on the border of that, right? But agriculture in the Midwest and the upper Midwest is forecast to see substantial crop yield increase over time. Why? Because the longer growing seasons and so on, right? So you can start to combine those. So people go, oh, well, it's okay, we'll just catch fish instead. Well, that gets even worse because the fish yields, which are a lot of Asia is very dependent on, they're forecast to decline because of changing ocean patterns and so on, and the fisheries in the northern mid-latitudes and high latitudes will increase. If you look at the ability to be able to grow food, right? So this gets very local now, right? So this is a chart that's done by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US every year, and it looks at biomass production. So it's a pretty good approximation of your ability to be able to grow food, right? So, and plant-based food. And the reds and the blues are the highest levels. And this whole corridor here, which you're butting right up to, I think that agricultural production zone is going to be increasingly significant at a global level. And not just because you can grow the stuff, but remember on top of this, we have 20% of the world's freshwater resources. And we have this massive disconnect growing in the planet between where food can be grown and where food's going to need to be consumed. And this region here, you can make your own conclusions from the data, but anywhere in this whole zone here, there's a potential for an enormous potency to food production. Because it's one of the few places in the world where the tailwinds are driving you towards increased productive capability. And you put that in the context of global demand and where it's going to occur and so on. Okay, so energy, water, climate change and food. Challenges of a finite resource base and this unique Midwest resource combination. To me, it's the trifecta. If you've got the ability to be able to produce energy, you have water and you can produce food, that's like the winning trifecta, right? So the Midwest has this trifecta. There is the potential for unexpected trends. So just like fracking completely disrupted the whole energy world, well, there might be other potential disruptions that come as well. But there's this massive growing global disconnect between where food can be grown and where it will be consumed, and you're sitting right in the midst of that economy. So what do you think that means for Smithfield? Right? Think about the peri-urban zone, think about where you're located. You know, I'll just give you a minute in your groups. What do you think those data points mean for the future of Smithfield? So I'll give you a couple of minutes. Okay, so just another minute, we'll regroup. Okay, so let's regroup. Okay. All right, so let's look at the next piece, right? So let's talk about technology driving and enabling accelerated change, right? So, you know, we've talked about mass urbanisation, societal values, you know, global population and so on, possible implications. We've talked about food, water, energy, possible implications, technology driving enabled accelerated change. And this is a real defining piece, I think, that's going to dramatically shape our next 10 years. Because we're talking about 2030, remember it's Smithfield Vision 2030, and we're looking forward. So let's look at how technology might be part of this. So if you look at history, technology always moves at an exponential rate, right? And there's a number of factors because of that, but it's exponential in terms of its change. So if you imagine the last 100 years of technological change, so basically back to the Wright brothers onwards, right? And all the implications and impacts it's had in our lives, it's, you know, radically altered our lives. But because it's exponential, the next 100 years is going to feel more like 20,000 years of progress at today's rate. So it becomes unimaginable really fast, okay? But it's that speed of change that's gone from things like Jetsons to now we've got flying cars. And how did that happen? Or artificial intelligence, or robotics, automation, and all those things. So the next industrial revolution is going to be defined around things like advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, robotics, and life sciences. I want to talk a little about this, right? Because it's going to have radical disruption in how we live our lives, how we make things, what they're made of, and all sorts of stuff, right? So we know about 3D printing. If we just take that, right? We've all seen the simple 3D printing stuff, you know? Print a shot glass and drink out of it or whatever, right? But actually it's really much more interesting than that, right? So, because it's allowing manufacturers to now make things that were previously impossible, right? So if you look at engineering and things like turbines, you know, so anything that's about sort of this high intensity of production and so on that we're dealing with, getting rid of heat out of machinery is a really key part. And so what this is actually a piece of a conduit that allows liquids to circulate that strip the heat out of high performance equipment, right? But additive manufacturing allows you to be able to build those items in whole new ways. And in fact, because you're laying it down layer of molecule by layer of molecule, the properties can be different from one end to the other. So it's this absolute revolution in terms of manufacturing. Also, it changes where things can be made. It can make things much more localized. The thing I don't think has yet really played out is where does, and that's why the arc of innovation to me is really interesting, you know, where does all this food processing, manufacturing, innovation occur? If you can start to make it more mobile and your population's concentrating in mega cities, does that start to drag a lot of that traditional industry into peri-urban spaces in different scales? It also allows for greater complexity and speed of prototyping. And this is the sort of impact on all sorts of things actually, but this is 1990 to 2015. This is the number of people employed in manufacturing in the US. And that, by the way, we know the whole issue that that's led to in terms of the discontent from people who had good jobs in, you know, middle class America, manufacturing jobs. Those jobs went away, but that's that decline. And what we don't talk about much is this is the output per person involved in manufacturing. And in fact, in the last couple of years, that has jumped dramatically again because of digitisation of of factories. In other words, they build a digital replica of it and they're able to. And that's a whole other story we can talk about another time. But this is sale of industrial robots, right? So essentially what's happening is productivity goes through the roof because we're applying all the technology of the next industrial revolution. And it is displacing people from traditional manufacturing jobs. So we know about robots in the workplace. You know, we've all a lot of us have this mental picture of industrial robots. But increasingly they're looking like this. Small, agile, almost Android, human assist, cheap, fast, learning, self-learning, and so on. Okay? So, we talked a bit about autonomous technology. Here's some examples of this being applied, right? So this is from a part of the world I know very well, which is Western Australia. We have some of the largest iron ore mines in the world, dig up basically mountains of iron ore and send it to steel mills around the world. They're in remote locations, so they're in the outback, you know, 1,500 kilometres or more from the capital city. The workforce flies in, flies out. The stated intention of those mining companies is to have nobody on site. Right? So they are literally going through a whole process of automation, and you're going to see this, by the way, cascade in industry after industry in the next decade. You know, Norway already has snow plows that clear runways that are autonomous vehicles. Mining and those sort of things in airports are good because you don't have people that might get run over, right? So they're a sort of a low-risk initial environment. So here's how it works, right? So you have all the equipment. Some of the largest trains in the world no longer have drivers. You know, you have rock crushers, haul trucks loaded up with telemetry, all operated out of the capital city. People at consoles like, you know, Houston Control Center for, you know, space missions, right? That's mining. That's already happening. That's well underway. That's old news, right? How long before agriculture can go fully autonomous? And we're really close to it, right? Really, my personal view, I grew up at a farm, I drove the tractor, I got the whole deal, right? The only reason that we had that person turning that tractor around at the end of the row is to feel like they got a job. They're actually not needed, right?
GPS with guidance, basically for not just agriculture, but
Yeah.
for construction.
Construction's the next one that's coming.
Training, all that stuff.
It's all that automation that runs the Amazon distribution centers and so on. But then my question is, as somebody who has a real interest in rural, regional areas and that sort of interface with these mega cities, what happens when agriculture goes fully autonomous? When we can run a 100,000 acre farm and we can do it from Kansas City or Chicago, and it's not dumb farming. This is high technology farming, loaded up with sensors. What happens to our rural communities? And I'm posing this to you because you're right there in that line. To one side of you is the metropolis, to the other side of you is all the way to, where? Omaha, Des Moines? And quite frankly, I personally see a future where there will be very few humans engaged in that landscape. And sooner than we'd want to think, right? Okay, so let's talk more about technology. So this is the cost of sequencing the human genome, right? So in 2001, it was $100 million, right? In 2021, it's going to be closer to $10. And I could show you chart after chart. I'll show you charts about the cost of solar power and so on. You know, that's what technology is driving. That's why this next industrial revolution, it's about speed of change. Now, what are the implications when you go from $100 million to $10 in the space of 20 years? And we've barely begun to see the medical advantages that come out of the research that's associated with this whole notion of genomic medicine. Genomic medicine, in the layman's terms, is you've got some horrendous, horrible, incurable disease, one shot, and you're cured. They're already now vaccinating babies who have rare spinal disorders, fix them with one shot. Now, that might cost $4 million or $700,000 versus a lifetime of care. So, we're dealing with machine learning, artificial intelligence, converging technologies, exponential impacts. let me talk about this, right? Because I think this will kind of crystallize this. So I'm interested in agriculture and food. That's one of my sort of backgrounds, right? So how might the next industrial revolution shape food and agricultural industries? Okay, so what this chart is, tries to put it together. It's drawn from a Deloitte's work on Industry 4.0, and I put an agricultural overlay. Down here, these coloured bars here, are what you would call the exponential technologies. So in this case, things like biotech, neurotech, nanotech, sensing, 3D food printing, artificial intelligence, robotics, drones. Every one of those is a fascinating topic area, right? Which has got, you know, tens of millions, hundreds of $millions being invested at it, innovations occurring at warp speed, and so on, right? All exponential technologies. What hasn't happened yet is the system completely clicking together. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about it from a point of view of food, but you think about what it might mean for a community like Smithfield. Okay, so let's take this. So we have Watson. Why is Watson there? Well, Watson is IBM's supercomputer, right? What the holy grail for food scientists is to work out how to manipulate your taste or your taste sensation. So if I can feed you something and it triggers pleasurable reactions, right? That's the food scientist's holy grail. So Watson program trying to figure out how do we manipulate human taste and flavour. Sensory intelligence, 3D food printing. People go, that's like nonsense, that's not going to happen, right? Well, here's where I think it will happen. 3D food printing, right? So first of all, they're sorting out the texture issue, so it looks less like slop now, right? So where would you want to apply 3D food printing? Well, there's a few places, right? Something like a fast food place would make sense, where it's the same thing, repetitive. Those areas, they're really ripe for automation. Here's other places though. What are we in here? High school. You have hundreds of spawn here every day, right? We're in the cafeteria, they get fed. But they're all over the place in terms of their nutrient requirements, their metabolic position in life, their all that stuff, right? Imagine if you could have highly customized meals for each person that provided exactly what they needed at their point in life. Remember the 2 billion people who don't get enough and the 2 billion people who've got too much? Imagine if we could solve that by having highly customized meals. Imagine a hospital where there are all sorts of people who have different recovery requirements and they're different medication, and if that could all be baked into the process, that'd be kind of interesting, right? Okay, synthetic foods. The whole issue here of laboratory-grown things, meat replacements, Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger, all those type of things. Water purification, gene splicing, vertical farming. There's an entire whole movement going on. People saying, how do we grow food in our cities? Vertical farms. Now, they haven't got past the lettuce yet, right? You know, the green spinachy stuff, right? But at some point they will, but there's high value crops that get grown in that environment. I would argue that in the upper Midwest, or the Midwest in general, what you'll start to see in the peri-urban spaces is controlled agriculture in larger scale, because you've got water and you've got a large marketplace right there, and year-round production. This idea of shipping in fruit and veggies or whatever from all over the world, I'm going to argue the economics are going to change on that. Okay? So vertical farming, nano printing, autonomous tractors, global connectivity, robotic food processing, drone delivery. When all that clicks together, what does it look like? Yeah, that's a very interesting point, right? Because here's the deal, right? Where are the people in this story?
Well, you have to have people fly, bro. You have to have people programming.
Exactly right.
You have to have people work on the ground.
Yes, and that's part of society reconfiguring where people live, right? And I think the jury's out in terms of what the macro impacts are in terms of the role that humans have, right? That's for sure is going to change, but we've actually been through these type of big iterations before. We went through mass production and we went through automobiles that displaced all the blacksmiths and all that sort of common stuff that we know, right? So we have an ability to be able to adapt. It's just going to mean that there's going to be change, and it's going to be change that's going to be quicker than we're probably used to because of the way it's exponential and the way it's going. So, technology in the next industrial revolution, impacting every corner of our lives, capacity to radically disrupt systems, changes in where and how things will be made. There'll be new materials and new products that will come with it. What does that mean for Smithfield? Because one of the things that I'm going to show you next is the survey data, and one of the things that people talk about as the biggest opportunity here is economic development. Now you draw your own conclusions, right? But I start to put together some of these data points and I say you're in a peri-urban space and you're spitting distance to a major international airport. What does that mean? And the question is, what does it mean? And we're going to talk about, are you going to be a player or not a player, for whatever reasons, right? In some of these emerging economies, how does that work into your community and so on, right? But just at the level of technology driving, enabling accelerated change, what do you think that means for your future? A couple of minutes gone. Okay, so just another minute and we'll regroup. And we're going to take a break in about 10 minutes, so if you just hang with us until then. Okay, so let's regroup. Okay, thank you. Hello, Smithville. Okay, thank you. So let's just hear a couple of quick comments, right? Just, we won't go too far into this because you've had a chance at the tails, but when you look at this whole technology, in fact, all of what we've talked about, let me ask you this question. How are you feeling about the future right now? So who's kind of excited about things? Okay, who's a little bit terrified about things? Okay, good. That could be the same people, right? All right. So here's the point, though, right? I want to just try and draw the threads together. So we're going to now start to turn our attention to your community and your desires for the future. The point of doing this exercise, right, going through these trends, and by the way, this slide deck will be available on the portal. It's been recorded if you want to kind of revisit any of it as well. But this is the world that we all are going into, whether you like it or not. And what we're going to talk about today with that as a context is how do you position yourself, taking into account these macro trends. And why we have to understand those is if you don't consider those, you may just inadvertently be putting yourself into a corner, right? Or not anticipate things that may be advantageous for you or may be headwinds to you. Okay, we talked about some of that, about the creep of the urban, of Kansas City, or of these metropolises. We add another 100 million people to cities in the US between now and 2050. Well, I can guarantee you there's going to be a bunch of them just south of you. And so on, right? All right, so now I want to pivot, right? So we want to just talk about a couple of internal trends or things that are happening here. I'm going to draw from two sources of data. We're producing a benchmark report at the moment, which is a little bit of a longitudinal study of Smithville, but really we're doing a side-by-side comparison with 20 other similar communities across the Midwest. And they are similar population size, similar in that they have, they're on the edge of one of these sort of mega urban sort of locations and close to an international airport, right? And so you'll be able to see how you stack up, right? We aren't quite finished with that, but we're close. And I'm going to cover some of the community survey results. So we're now pivoting from these trends to now starting to think about yourself as a community, right? And that's going to be our focus for the rest of the day with those macro trends and backgrounds. So this is your population, right? You know this. We go from 1990, really a very small, probably rural community, through to now where you've had substantial population increase. That probably is going to continue to grow pretty rapidly. So it changes the character of your community, but also your relationship to the metropolis and your relationship to that sort of agricultural production zone. This is your resident age profile. So you have a 30 to 39, 40 to 49, your adult populations at the highest level. You're really good at having kids. That's obvious, right? You can see that there's the highest single cohort is 0 to 9 and 10 to 19. And that is really interesting, right? I mean, that firmly places you absolutely as you're a family-based, child, school-aged, family-based community. But you do have an older population. Just remember though, so we do work in lots of different communities, and I've been working in others that are 10 or 15 years down the track from you, right? Like further ahead. So this 40 to 49, which is your highest adult population, is going to be in its 50s and 60s, right? So what we want to be starting to think about as we look at 2030 is it's an anticipation of where your demographic structure could look or could go, right? This is the commuter inflow-outflow. So there's 368 people who live and work in Smithville. There's 1,500 people who commute in each day, or that's what they report, or their employers report. But there are 4,000 people who commute out. And I assume that arrow probably should point south, rather than now that I think about that, right? But obviously you're a commuter-based community, right? Okay, so your family commuter-based. The data is very clear on that. We'll see in the benchmark, but this is a very strong bias in the direction in terms of that data. And then, of course, you've got some other outside issues that may change. So this is traffic through Kansas International Airport, Mid-Continental International. It's been obviously a strong airport for a long time, right? Flatlining. What do you think the forecasts are for the future? Yeah, I mean that's 75% of people who voted in favour of the terminal bond or the reconstruction, right? That's a pretty strong bet on that your location as a logistics and distribution, and I would argue also anticipation of where food and all those things are going. So that becomes a very interesting play, and we're going to talk about that more today. In terms of the community surveys, we've had 337 respondents so far. We do hope we'll see more of that. This data will be online fairly soon, but we're going to have one more push to try and get people to do it. Most people live in Smithville. There's a group that sort of work in Smithville, and the mayor, of course. I'm the elected official. Just joking, of course, right? In terms of age group of people who responded to the survey, right? So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a profile of that so you can see the results. Very strong in the 31 to 50 year age group. So that's great actually, because that's your core adult population. Getting the busy people in these age groups to respond is always a problem, but here we are 25% plus, right? How long have you lived or worked at Smithfield? I think this starts to get really interesting, right? 0 to 5 years, right? 30%. 10 to 20 years. But so we know there's different cohorts because your population, curve shows that. But at least this survey data allows you to look at that. And when you look at it, when we load it online, you'll be able to filter out to see what these people say versus maybe what these people are saying about the same topics, right? Because there may be different views. We don't get it, right? But I want to just show you a couple of the charts of these were responses to open-ended questions. So what do you believe are the biggest opportunities for the future of Smithfield in the next 5 to 10 years? Business attraction, big deal. So I started to touch on that earlier, right? Oh, and by the way, people wrote their responses and we categorised their answers. So we wanted people just to write, and then we said, okay, people are saying these type of things, and these were the categories that we attributed their comments to. You'll be able to see the raw comments when we upload it. More restaurants, retail, economic growth. So, they're all the same broad bucket there, right? But that's the biggest opportunities. Capitalising on the lake, more amenities, retention, small town feel, you'll see that come through a lot, demographic growth and so on. And the education system is universally recognised as one of your big assets. What do you think are the biggest threats to the future of Smithfield in the next 5 to 10 years? Complacency and attitude. Too much growth. So we have this little bit of a conundrum in the data, right? Which is people going, we want growth, and then people going, are we in danger of losing our small town feel? There's a danger of too much growth, right? You're going to get to play this out in some detail, right? Infrastructure, education system, lack of economic growth, lack of business support, overpopulation, lack of amenities and so on, right? What do you think are Smithfield's strengths? Sense of community, small town feel, the lake, education system, proximity to Kansas City, quality of life, geographic location. So we're starting to see some good reinforcement of themes that are coming through there. And then so the key outcomes from the community survey today, right? The critical issues to us. So if you don't like the words, shoot me, right? Because this is just our interpretation. We're trying to synthesise what you're saying, right? Big issue around a perception of complacency in the attitude of the community, and that's probably to change and to speed of change. Too much growth is a concern, or the potential of too much growth, and I don't know whether that's too much growth in the absolute sense or growth that gets out of our control, right? It starts to head in a direction that we didn't really want it to go, because once it's happened, it's really hard to undo it, right? By the way, that's the point of this planning process, to get ahead of that. You do the deep thinking about where you want to end up. That allows a framework for your city and other groups to be able to start to lay out that policy framework and that growth trajectory, all that pattern. Concern about lack of infrastructure, the education system, so overcrowding in classrooms, stop breeding. Lack of economic growth, business support, overpopulation, concerns about the loss of small town feel, right? So those are the key things. I just skipped those, right? So we're going to do this little exercise, right? Then we're going to take a break, right? So on your sheets, on your tables, you all got one of these sheets, right? And we're going to get you to have a vote about what you think you're strong at and weak at as a community. I'm going to walk you through this sheet, and this correlates exactly to the sheets that are on the windows in the front of the room, right? So let me just run through this. So this is from just a sort of a combination of research that looks at successful communities, particularly sort of rural communities or smaller communities. So I'm just going to run through each one. As I go through it, think about, would you say you're good at this or you're weak at it, right? So evidence of strong community pride and inclusive culture. Successful communities often show places of care, attention to history and heritage, celebrate their success, have a strong and positive local attitude, support a culture of risk-taking and innovation. Diversity is often celebrated when people are welcomed. 2, invest in the future, built to last. People believe that something worth doing is worth doing right. In addition to brick and mortar investments, all decisions are made with an outlook on the future. Expenditures are considered investments in the future, including investments in people. Right? Participatory approach to community decision making. Even the most powerful of opinion leaders seem to work toward building consensus. The stress is on working together toward a common goal and focuses on positive results. People collaborate and share resources. So remember, as we go through, are you strong at this or are you weak at this as a community? Creatively build new economic opportunities. Successful communities build on existing economic strengths in a realistic way and explore new economic opportunities provided by the new economy. And that means sort of whatever new dimensions they are. It might be food processing or it might be IT or something, but just economic platforms. 5, support local businesses. Local loyalty is emphasised, but thriving communities know who their competitors are and position themselves accordingly. 6, deliberate transition of power to new leaders. People under 40 regularly hold key positions in civic and business affairs. Women and people from minority groups. And I say that in inverted commas because I don't think women are a minority group. Often hold positions as elected officials, plant managers and entrepreneurial developers. 7, strong believer in support for education. Good schools are the norm. 8, strong presence of traditional institutions that are integral to community life, so churches, schools, service clubs, sporting clubs and so on, strong influences. 9, willingness to seek help from the outside. People seek outside help for community needs and compete for grants and contracts for economic and social programs. They seek out the best ideas and new people to help build their community strengths. So in other words, if you're good at that, you're a sponge. You're absorbing in the best of everything. 10, communities are self-reliant. There's a wide-held conviction that in the long run you have to do it yourself. All right, so they're the attributes. We're going to get you to have a vote, right? The sheets on the windows at the front here, they're numbered 1 to 10, same as what's on your sheet. On your tables, there's strips of dots. So you get 4 red dots and 4 green dots. The green dots are for those attributes that you believe you're strong at, right? So to see each sheet has the type, the name of the attribute, and it has one side that says strong, one side that says weak. The red dots are for those attributes you believe you're weak at. You can vote however you want. So you might feel really strongly about one thing and say, I'm putting all my 4 red dots on that one issue. You can do that, right? Or you might put 1 on 4 different ones or 2 on 1, whatever you want to do to sort of reflect the emphasis that's in your mind. So any questions on what you're doing with these? Yeah?
So are you speaking how we feel the city of Smithville is or versus?
So we're asking the question, we're asking you to rate yourselves on those attributes in terms of the community. So when I say city, I don't mean the administration, I mean the community of Smithville. Do you believe as a community you're strong or weak at those different attributes, right? At this current time, right? And when you come up, there's a yoga mat here that covers whatever it is, a cord, so don't trip over that, please. We're going to give you 10 minutes to get all your dots up, then be back in your chairs ready to roll. You can mark it on your sheet and then stick your dots up, or you can just run and put your dots up, whatever you like. There's water and fruit at the back, bathrooms, into it.
I don't mean to, but every 3 months I'm like, no? Sorry. Can I just write red on top of the green?
Your turn, right? My girl, my girlfriend is on the shore, and she told me I'm on our association.
Oh, you got to be.
I would love to teach the president of the HOA. That's what she told me. And we're Genesis right now. We've just taken
I don't know if it's
so, we've got a great board, dedicated people. You are very fortunate. Very fortunate. Yeah.
So you see stakeholder downtown, yeah?
I think a lot of you residents
We're retiring. We're essentially retiring.
Yeah. You've got
that situation, then what we do another way. We got a lot of young families and beauty items over there. I'm pushing very hard to have
I would love that. See, I'm
Exactly. Yeah, I'm 68. Going to be 68 this fall. There's nothing. We have no Thank you. I'm putting together a coalition. I'm working together a coalition. Love it. I love it.
my skin still, I'm gonna rust out.
Yeah.
But
Now, I want to show you something real quick.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Different stuff down here.
But they're not dead.
We're also taking a short break while we do this, so make sure you use the bathroom, grab the food, water. We'll recommend about 5 minutes.
My head's big every time I do
He does very well.
I'm having mine.
Oh, well, you come down, we love to take care of you. Nice to see you.
No, you're not either. I don't find too many that are Smithville natives. I'm not either. I just moved here 2 years ago. So. Wow. Have you been here long? Oh, do you really? Oh my goodness! Wow. Very cool. Do you like it? Do you like the area and everything? Yeah, I do too. Oh, have you? Okay. Are you from the area? I mean, are you from around here? Yeah. Oh my God. It's kind of nice to be able to see where everybody's from, you know? Small towns are not homegrown small towns anymore, you know? There's so many different people that come and connect, so very interesting. How are you? Good. How are you?
How's it going? You did what everything you could. You gave it your best.
Well, I know his people.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I'm glad you're here.
And I think it's easy to see that people think they got a Climatic when they had to start putting the emojis, so you know how people feel. Instead of just like, they do a heart, they do an angry, they do a sad. Like, you have to explain yourself that much.
I know she was down in the
Okay, if you take your seats, please.
If you can handle another 20 years before we're getting there, good on you.
There you go.
Okay. Grab some water, grab some fruit, take a seat.
Well, that'll work. If I have to, that'll work. Yeah, that's all good.
What's up, my yesterday? We had 3 meetings in one day.
Okay, so let's regroup. Feel free to stand actually, because we're going to just, we're not going to be here for too long, okay? But if you can stop talking, that'd be great. Okay, thank you. So let's have a look at what you came up with in terms of the answers to these attributes, right? So you may not be able to see all the sheets, so I'll just run through them from the front here, right? So this was one, evidence of strong community, pride, and inclusive culture. Let me just ask, for those people who put a red dot here, which was on evidence of strong community, pride, and inclusive culture, because there's kind of two parts of that, one about community pride, one is inclusive culture. If you put a red dot there, hands up if that was because of the inclusive culture. Okay, hands up if that was because it was pride. Okay, a bit of both. All right, good, okay. So we're still split on that one. Invest in the future, built to last, leans more towards a weakness. Is that because of sinkholes or something? Just kidding, right? It says bring your approach to community decision making. That's kind of split, right? So some people are saying there's a strength there, about the same number saying it's a weakness. Creatively building new economic opportunities very strongly skews to being a weakness. I actually saw Carol from the Chamber put her dot there. Literally. Support local businesses. There's kind of a bit of a, probably it's leaning slightly more to a strength than a weakness. Then over here we have the deliberate transition of power to new leaders. That's leaning towards a weakness. Strong belief in support for education. That's totally recorded as a strength. Strong presence in traditional institutions that are integral to community life. Almost everybody there is saying that's a strength. Willingness to seek help from the outside. That leans to a weakness. And communities are self-reliant seems to be split. What does that tell you about how future ready you are? We've been talking about the future for an hour and a bit this morning. So what evidence is there of not ready? Well, here's what I see, right? So here's where the weaknesses predominantly show up. Invest in the future, built to last, right? A future-orientated attribute. Creatively building new economic opportunities, predominantly a weakness. Transition of power to new leaders, predominantly a weakness. So 3 attributes at least that are leaning towards very much the future. Where your strengths are the more kind of traditional community strengths is what I'd say. Things like traditional institutions that are integral to community life, strong belief in support for education, that's your strong suit, the whole education story, right? Support local businesses to a degree, right? So as we think about the next part, what we want to do is to sort of take this into account, right? Thinking that what you're saying on those attributes at least is that your own self-assessment suggests that you're not what I call really geared up to be future ready because you're weak in the areas that are future leading or future looking. You know, new leadership, new economic opportunities, looking to the future, building to the future and so on. All right, so we want to now pivot to the scenario development framework, right? So this is where you're going to get to really wrestle with some of these big questions. And we're handing out a sheet. So if you can just grab it when that sheet comes, it looks like this, right? I'm going to walk everybody through it, right? But we printed one off so that you've all got one just because that's a little bit hard to see there. Okay, so if you just want to sort of hang on to that sheet, but stay with me on the screen while I walk us through this, right? Because I'll explain this scenario matrix. Because essentially we're going to spend the rest of the day working with this, right? And what this is, if you remember earlier I talked about that scenario planning is sort of built on this premise that we're standing here today looking to 2030, and there's no single future out there, but there's at least a range of plausible futures that you could reasonably speculate would be realistic that could happen, right? That's what we mean by plausible. So this framework here essentially creates our future canvas that's in the realm of plausibility. And what we're going to do today is sort of work through and describe these different futures and think about their implications and consequences, right? So from the work we've been doing with the surveys and the background research and so on, it became really obvious that there's a couple of major themes that people see as what you would call your big future splitting issues. What I mean by future splitting is if we go that way or we go that way on that theme, it's going to make a big difference to our future, okay? And so the 2 big future splitting themes were about what we called community evolution, and I'm going to explain the sort of endpoints on this, and infrastructure trajectory. And these are intended to be continuums, and these boxes here sort of give a description of the endpoints of those continuums. So if you think about the community evolution, so that's something that just runs through all the narrative in the surveys. You know, people see issues around that being strengths, weaknesses, threats, all that sort of stuff, right? So we want to play that out. We want to really tease out what would happen if you went this way or this way. What would that mean for your community as we look out to 2030? So at this end, the description is, this is a what if on this axis of community evolution. The what if is, well, what if we took and really pursued that small town focus, okay? The community focuses exclusively on internal key priorities and strong school district and peaceful neighbourhoods. The community protects the small town feel and focuses on retaining more traditional values. Okay? What would happen over time? We're going to give you some ways to think about that. That's one possible direction in community evolution. None of these are intended to be good, bad, or anything else. They're just different possible futures, and we want to explore the implications. The other end of this continuum is we're saying here, okay, expanded worldview. The community leverages its proximity to the airport and Kansas City metropolis, we've been talking about that, positioning itself as a vibrant, small community that is connected to the world. The community focuses on being attractive and relevant to a wide cross-section of people. Different kind of orientation or approach in terms of community evolution. Okay? So, two ends of that continuum, sort of what if ends. This axis here, the vertical axis, infrastructure trajectory. Again, this is a really strong theme that comes through all of the survey work and the background, all the previous planning that's been done and so on. So this end here, so again, two ends of a continuum. This end here is focused on existing strengths. The community focuses on modest, cost-conscious infrastructure solutions and limits the scale and pace of development. So that's, we're worried about money here. The community is primarily designed for residential development and focuses on quality of life for residents. Okay, one possible end on that continuum. The other one at the top, modernized and revitalized. There is a focus on investing in infrastructure solutions that embrace new technology and offer quality amenities. The community invests in creating a range of innovation areas such as downtown corridor, recreation zones, and new business development. Right? That would be connected to the new economy and other things. So, two macro themes with some endpoints, right? So then what that creates is these four scenario spaces. So scenario A, B, C, and D. So if you look at scenario B here on the screen, we've got that little red light, right? So that is a future that is defined and created by the combination of the endpoints, these two endpoints on the axis. So scenario B is playing out a future where Smithville couples together modernized and revitalized, with expanded worldview. What would happen if you took those two focuses in tandem? Okay? Scenario C is a future where the defining kind of characteristics are expanded worldview and focus on existing strengths. What would happen in the community going forward? And so on, right? So four different combinations. Now, they're going to have some commonalities because they share at least one dimension. So scenario B and C share the expanded worldview. They have a very different direction on infrastructure, trajectory, and so on, right? So I'm going to walk you through the work you're going to do in the breakout groups, and then I'm going to come back to this diagram and we're going to do a little bit of sort of practice thinking from a scenario point of view. And the point is that this creates our future canvas here. These issues, by the way, are very much in your control. So you're going to have to wrap the kind of macro context around this, thinking about those external macro trends, right? Because that's sort of the environment that surrounds this set of scenarios for your future. So we're going to assign you randomly to four groups, right? And you're going to be in a group to work on one of these scenarios with your colleagues here. And we're going to do this. You're going to have a group leader. So we already have somebody who's appointed to keep you on track. Right? Their job, if they speak to you and say, stop talking, your job is to stop talking, right? No, they're just there to keep you on track and on task and help answer questions, right? A timekeeper that can manage the timeline. So we have a fair bit of work to get through, right? So we're going to have to be pretty focused and purposeful going through this. And you're going to be in breakout groups in classrooms, right? There's going to be a recorder to record the summary of your deliberations in templates. Then somebody can write it on some boards and you're going to have a couple of people come and present it back to the whole group, right? So we're going to give you an hour and a half or so to work on these scenarios and then come back. And you're doing the deep thinking for whichever scenario you're allocated to. You're doing that deep thinking on behalf of everybody here, but also on behalf of the whole community, because the community is going to use this as a framework to think about priorities going forward. So the timeline, we're going to have you in your groups by 11:15. You're going to spend 10 minutes scoping out that scenario. So if you're in scenario A, you're going to say, okay, well, we're in this future where we're coupling together a small town feel with, whatever, right, the modernized and so on. What would that mean, right? So you just get on the same page together. We're going to get you to develop some detailed scenario characteristics, and I'll explain that to you. So that's going to be where you're really speculating how would Smithville look in 2030 under the scenario conditions that you're given, right? How would, not whether you like it or not, don't have to try and fix it. Your job is just to play that world out, and we'll see where you end up. We're then going to get you to develop some headline news. So that will give us, the characteristics will give us the 2030 endpoint. The headline news will give us this sense of what the progress looks like in that future. What's the trajectory? What are the implications and what's happening? Then a short scenario name. 12:30 we're going to have a bag lunch back in here, and then we're going to be back ready to present to the whole group. In terms of the characteristics here, we're going to give you 4 topics, and your group leader is going to break you down probably into 4 small groups, right? So you'll be working with 2 or 3 4 other people on these. So you can go to one that's of particular interest to you. So economic and industry, that's really an important one, because if you think about what you're saying up on the board here, community and societal, how would that play out under the scenario you're given? The environment and the landscape, and education. And we added education because it's so important here, right? It's such a big deal. And so you really want to make sure you're considering intended and unintended consequences, because there might be, on some scenarios, unintended consequences on education that you want to consider, right? And then just as some suggested dimensions to consider. So under each one of these, just to give you an idea of the sort of things to wrestle with. Economic and industry, housing access and affordability, transportation options and connectivity, business profiles. So you want to be thinking, trying to describe that world from an economic and industry perspective. What types of businesses would be here? Would you have more or less? What sort of what industry sector would they belong to? So on. How would transportation work? Community and societal. What's happening to the small town feel under your scenario conditions? How does that, is that sort of being enhanced or changed or in any way? Community amenities and services, the feel and the vibe of the place. Is this a place that's like a Sleepy Hollow, or is it, zipping along somewhere, just try and get into the mood of it. Population makeup, number and locations. Is your population, what would it look like under the scenario you're going to work on? Is there going to be more people? How many more people? Where are they going to come from? We know what the current sort of profile looks like, right? In terms of you're very good at producing babies, right? Does that continue under future conditions? Environment and landscape, so streetscapes and downtown, what's going on there? Ecological health and diversity, land use and public spaces, what's going on in that? Education, what's the focus and reputation? Are you continuing to push and be a successful school district, or are you being challenged? The delivery and locations of learning, because under education it might just not be kids. Think about education at the level of lifelong learning. If you've got more people here who are moving into retirement, mostly they don't want to just sit and watch television all day, right? People want to stay actively engaged with living longer. So what would learning look like in this community? What would be the size of the student population and the makeup? Just suggestions, right? Just to get you started. You'll get all these handouts in the breakout groups. Then in terms of headline news, headlines for 2020, 25, 2030, right? So the point of all of this is you're creating this really rich narrative around those different scenarios. So, and we want it in a way so that you can really feel what it would be like. You can imagine what it would be like to be in Smithville under the scenario you're working on. The good, the bad, the ugly, right? The pros, the cons, the winners and losers, really kind of map that out. This is not a utopia, dystopia exercise. This is mapping out a range of plausible futures that we can then react to, knowing that there's going to be different implications and so on. All right, so any questions on that so far? Is the task before you clear? Okay, you're going to have an hour and a bit, right? So don't panic, but you're going to have to work at this, right? But you're smart people. I know you're here because you are committed, right? You signed up to be here, you want to be part of this sort of deeper thinking, that's what this is. So let's just do a little bit of a practice thinking together while we're here. So let's just pick scenario A, right? So don't worry about which one you're going to be allocated to, but let's just take scenario A just to get our minds into this sort of concept of scenarios. So we've got the community evolution and the infrastructure trajectory, and the two macro conditions that frame scenario A are focused on the small town oasis. So we're focusing on internal key priorities. We've got a strong school district, peaceful neighbourhoods, the community protects the small town feel, focusing on traditional values, right? Coupled with, there's a focus on investing in infrastructure solutions to embrace new technology and offer quality amenities. The community invests in creating a range of innovation areas such as downtown corridor, recreation zones, and new businesses. What would be the sort of implications in this scenario? What would we see in that scenario if we were to look out to 2030? How do you think Smithfield might evolve under those two unique conditions coupled together? And again, this is not right or wrong, this is an exploration of the future.
Busier downtown.
So you'd have a busier downtown, right? And you're saying that because you're focusing on it here, right? Okay. But you still got that downtown feel that would be that small town downtown, right? So what type of businesses then do you think would naturally be in that type of downtown?
An amazing barbecue restaurant.
All right. See, there's no bias, right? Obviously, right? But you want to get to that kind of level where you're sort of thinking about, okay, if we're going to have a busier downtown, think about, okay, well, what's that downtown going to look like? Okay, because we're dealing with some of this. What type of businesses would be there? Would we have some sort of like startups that are happening above shops or something? You know, kind of just think those type of things through, right? What else do you think might be happening in this type of scenario in some of those other dimensions, like education and the environment and the landscape and society and so on?
I think you might look at a town that's planted with natives, pollinator gardens, you might have recreational opportunities, private rental corridors that go to the lake, those kind of things. You come into the downtown, you see something beautiful, and then you can expand from there.
Yeah, okay, great. So you're adding a lot of detail there in terms of, okay, you'd be like, all the stuff you said, like that real focus on you're in that bubble, right? And you're making that bubble as perfect as you can, right? But you're applying technology and these ideas about how do you maintain environmental habitats and, you know, use different modes of transportation. So you might even have less cars in the downtown, right? You might have different modes of transportation because you're coupling together and you're investing in these type of things and you're coupling it together with that small town oasis, right? Yeah. Can you speak up just a little?
Sorry, I have a different perspective on some of this stuff. I'm looking at, okay, small town races, that's number one. Leapfrog over to modernized and revitalized, that's number two. Drop straight down to focusing on consistent streets, that's number three. Add all that together, it equals number four, expanding what we do.
Okay, but that's not what we're doing, right? Okay, but what you just pointed out was one of the classic pitfalls, right? All right, so let me just skip one for you. Here's the potential pitfalls, right? So your job, if you're in scenario A or B or C or D, your job is to stay in that scenario. I know I'm in a room full of people who fix things. Okay, you're fixers, right? You want to make things better, fix things that are broken. So your tendency is going to be, oh, I don't like where this is going, or something, right? Your job, though, suspend that for the next hour and a bit, right? You can get back to that soon enough, right? So your job is to stay in your swim lane, your scenario. Okay? If you're in A, you're not working on B. You're not wishing you were working on B. You don't have B envy. All right? Your job is to play that scenario. And remember, you're doing this on behalf of this whole group. Because if you're in scenario group A, they're the only people working on A. You're doing it on behalf of this whole group and on behalf of the community, right? So I'm going to invite you to, ask you to discipline yourself to dig into that world, right? And really play that out and just see how it goes. I have no idea what you're going to come up with, right? So we want to find that out. Another pitfall, trying to fix it, right? You get in there and you go, oh, I don't like this is not what I want. We're going to get to what you want down the track, right? But we first of all have to do the work to lay out what are the plausible scenarios and really understand the implications. What you're dealing with is not simple, right? You're dealing with a range of complex, interrelated factors here. Societal evolution, macro trends, economic development in the industry and so on, and trying to anticipate the future. Another pitfall, having an emotional reaction. I want you to be objective forecasters. No, don't worry about the emotional reaction. Just put that aside. This is an exercise where we're forecasting the future under the conditions that you are given. We want to explore the futures, don't decide on preference. We're going to get to that this afternoon, right? And I know this won't happen here, but people dominating the discussion, right? All right, so make sure that in your groups, right, that everybody gets a chance to weigh in. You may not start with being on the same page, right? You're going to have to think this through, and if you go, well, I think this would happen under this scenario, and you think something different, well, why is that? How are you seeing it that I'm not, or what am I missing, or what data set are you drawing from to draw that conclusion, right? Have that sort of an educational process with each other.
You have to worry about budget.
Well, so you're not, yeah, but you're not making well, okay, there's you straight back to the swim lane business, right? Down here, if you're in one of these scenarios, you're worried about modest cost conscious infrastructure solutions. If you're in one of these scenarios, you're worried about investing in infrastructure solutions that embrace new technology and offer quality amenities. You're interested in that, right?
That's money.
Maybe, not necessarily though, right? Because there is the opportunity for technology to actually deliver significant savings. Think of resource management, for example. Water efficiency, all those type of things, right? So don't just play this out, right? You'll get to a point to be able to think about, okay, is that going to be worth our investment? But that's the next step in the process, okay? So remember, we're in this stage of the process and you're just mapping out this scenario. Okay, and what you said, by the way, is embedded perfectly into this. That issue about, okay, if we're focused on modest cost-conscious infrastructure solutions, and we're going to focus on existing strengths, and we're going to limit scale and pace of development, how does the community evolve? What's the implications on that? Okay, that's what you've got to think through. Okay? Good question though, right? Okay, any other questions on this or what we're asking you to do? Okay, so I'm now going to randomly assign you to a group, right? So A, B, C, D, 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 A, B, C. Oh, no. Anybody, did I miss anybody? Where are we up to? D. Alright? Okay, so don't go yet, you don't know where to go. Okay. Alright, so, can I have the team leaders to the front, please, right? So Nikki, Jason, Cynthia and Carol volunteer to be team leaders. Alright, so here's what we're going to do. You've got from now, you're going to have 11:15 to 12:30, right? They're going to walk you through the timeline, give you the materials and so on. We're going to be back in here for a bag lunch at 12:30, so you have 75 minutes to work your way through this, right? Nikki, A, so if you're with A, you go with Nikki, and your room is down that corridor to the left. Biology classroom's down there, and there's signs on the door, right? So you go down there and go left. So A, go with Nikki. And no, just randomly changing groups, right? Okay, if you're in group B, you're with Jason, okay? He's going to take you out. We're going to bring all the materials to you. Cynthia is group C. If you're in C, you're with Cynthia. Go with her out the door. And if you're in D, you're with Carol. And you follow her out the door to the left.